welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about, are there contradictions in the Bible? The answer is no, there are not contradictions in the Bible. And this is something I hear people all the time say, oh, there are so many contradictions in the Bible. This is just simply not true. For those of you who are new to my channel, my name is Grace and I just want to welcome you guys here. I have a double major in psychology and religious studies with a minor in philosophy, and I hope that you guys enjoy the video. So there are a few important things to keep in mind when you are reading the Bible. First off, the Bible was never intended to be read by yourself. It was always meant to be safeguarded through the church, who could pass on the history of and the culture of a first century Jew, since that was the context in which it was written. And that it's very important to always maintain when you're reading the New Testament and the culture of ancient Judaism when you're reading the Old Testament. The other thing that's important to keep in mind when you're reading the Bible is that there are the three original languages. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, the New Testament was written in Greek, and the actual language that the people spoke in the New Testament was Aramaic, predominantly. And so that is very important to keep in mind when you're reading the New Testament. Now, something that's important as well is to understand that English is a very limited language, in the sense that the vocabulary that we have is not nearly as extensive as the vocabulary of Greek, for instance. An example of this is that in English we only have one word for the word love, whereas Greek has 4 or 5 words for love. And so it's, when you see love in the New Testament, it could mean one of several different words in Greek. So that is problem and issue number one that everyone has to keep in mind when reading the Bible. The second thing is that a contradiction means X and not X. It doesn't mean that somebody differs in what they say but not in what they assert. A true contradiction is X and not X. So Sally is a girl and Sally is not a girl. That is a contradiction. You cannot be a girl and not a girl at the same time. Or the ball is completely purple and the ball has no purple. You cannot be completely purple and have no purple at the same time. That is a true contradiction, X and not X. So having two descriptions of an event that are not identical does not mean that it's a contradiction. And particularly when you take into context ancient historical writing, which is different than the way that we write things today, the way that we write history, the way that we write biographies, etc. It's not the same that they wrote history and they wrote biographies in the writing of the New and the Old Testament, which is really important. It's very, very, very important that you are not anachronistic when reading the New or Old Testament. A good example of this is just the baptism account of Jesus in Matthew and Mark. They both say the same language. They say that God speaks and says, "You are my beloved son, with you I am well pleased." But in the Gospel of Matthew, he says, "This is my beloved son, with who I am well pleased." Note that this isn't a contradiction. Both of these Gospels are communicating the same message. The same truth is being told. They're just recounting it differently. This is something really, really, really important when you're reading history and when you're reading accounts of the Gospels and anything. And a good example of this is in police reporting. One of the key ways that investigators will know if a group of people who witnessed a crime are telling the truth is if there are inconsistencies in their stories, meaning that each person remembers the story a little bit differently. Because, and as somebody with a degree in psychology, this is just how we know for the brain to work, not everyone remembers things exactly the same. If people are using the same exact language to describe an event that happened, or they get every detail is the exact same, the investigators can actually know that those people are not telling the truth, because the human mind, everybody's mind is different and processes things a little bit different, and is going to use different language to describe an event that happened, and is going to recall details a little bit differently. There should never be drastic differences. For instance, if someone's recounting a car accident, they're not going to say a boulder, one person's not going to say a boulder came down the road and crushed the car, and another person say that a motorcycle drove into a pole. I mean, those are drastic differences, but slight details, the color of the car, for instance, what direction it was turning. There's a very minor differences where the brain is not going to be able to perfectly remember every single detail, and they're not going to be able to describe the event, and they shouldn't be describing the event in the exact same words. That's when you know that these people are working in conjunction with one another to remember or to write a story and to make up a story. So it actually adds to the validity of the Gospels, that they're not word for word, verbatim, exactly the same, because the people who are writing them are remembering the accounts in the way that their mind remembers those accounts. And in the case of Mark, who is John Mark, who is writing for Peter, he's talking to Peter, getting the memories from him, and then writing them down. So yeah, you're going to have some differences in how people remember the event, but the what's always being communicated during the event is always the same. The message remains the same. What they assert always is the same. So to truly look for a contradiction in scripture, you have to find not only X and not X, they're true at the same time in the same circumstance. You're dealing with a translated version of the Bible, you're going to start dealing with a lot of difficulties on yourself to be able to actually fully understand the circumstances and the language that is actually being spoken and communicated. So it's important to know that at this point in time, writing history was very important to be factual, but they also tried to make their accounts with a bit of poetry and beautifulness to it as well. At this point in time, and similar even today, although it's a little different now that we have cameras and recording material, a person that was recording a historical event, a speech that someone gave, etc., was allowed to kind of paraphrase in their own words what that person said, as long as it stayed true to what the message was actually asserting. And we still do this today. If someone asks us about a speech that we heard, we typically don't recite word for word what we heard, but give a general message of what we heard and what we took away, etc., and try to give our best explanation of what the speaker was trying to portray in his message. And oftentimes people in ancient history, in the way that they wrote history, they would also try to make things flow a little bit more cohesively, and so that it could actually be narrated more like a story and less of a choppy set of events. It's also important to realize that sometimes the authors themselves have their own personal feelings about something, and may, that affects the way that they write the story as well. And for instance, in Mark 5:26, we see that the hemorrhaging woman, she suffered much under many physicians, and she had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. But in Luke's account, and Luke was a physician so he probably didn't want to be, speak ill of those he worked with, or people that his colleagues essentially. He said she spent all her living upon physicians and could not be healed by anyone. And so he doesn't speak as poorly about the physicians as Mark did. However, both statements say the same thing. They communicate and convey the same message, but they're not identical. The form of writing that we're actually looking at in the Gospels, and I've been focusing on the Gospels, but this is true throughout the entirety of the Bible. The Gospels in particular were ancient biographies, and ancient biographies were much different than the biographies we're used to reading today. And I'll go over what ancient biographies looked like in another video in more detail, but it's important to know that ancient biographies were actually very short. They often did not include the entire life of a person, so they wouldn't necessarily start at birth and go through infancy and childhood and adulthood and all of that stuff. They usually had a very more focused way to them in that regard, where they would only focus on a portion of somebody's life. There are other key parts of ancient biographies, but this is one of them. But the purpose as well of ancient biographies was not just to communicate about somebody's life to the readers, but also to help edify the readers. So if you try to read the Gospels as you would a current biography or current history, and not in the way that they would have written ancient biography and ancient history, things are definitely going to be way more confusing for you. And once again, if you only try to look at it through the lens of English, even though it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and spoken predominantly in Aramaic, things are also going to end up confusing for you. And if you don't take into account the culture that it was written to and who the audience it was that was written to, which actually all 4 Gospels were written to different audiences, that's also going to cause difficulties for you. And so here's the issue with trying to refute the Bible on your own, or refute the Bible, with just trying to refute the Bible in general. The Bible is a very, very complex series of historical documents that have all been put into one book. And unfortunately, to fully understand the Bible, and this is why people that have a PhD do these things, to get a PhD, for instance, in biblical studies, you have to speak Hebrew, Greek, and even some Aramaic and Latin as well, because the early church spoke Latin. You have to study the culture of ancient Israel. You also have to study the corroborating texts that go with the Bible. One example of that is the Mishnah, which is ancient rabbinic literature and how they interpreted the Old Testament. All of these things help give clarification to what is the most complex book in the world. And so if you think that you're just going to open it up and pick out 2 verses and say, oh, well, these contradict each other, you're probably going to be wrong. And by probably, I mean definitely. There are no X and not X in the Bible that are in the same circumstance, or even are using the same verbiage if you translate it back to its original language of Hebrew or Greek or even Aramaic. With that being said, I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. I will see you guys on the next one. Some of the ones that I want to cover are who wrote the Gospels and how do we know that they're ancient biographies and those of the like. If you liked this video, please hit the like button, please hit subscribe, please share it with other people that you may think would find this video valuable. I hope that you guys have a great rest of the week.